Assalamu alaikum. Today, we're going to continue with what we have taken last time. We're going to understand how the soil-water-plant relationship works like. So, in the past lecture, we've started answering the question, how does the water moves from the plant? And today we're going to continue on this question and answering this question. We are also going to see some of the computer applications or softwares that can be used to model the root water uptake. In the last lecture, we have seen how can we measure the moisture content in the soil using certain devices like the tensiometer, like some of the sensors, and so on. Today, we're going to look at how can we express the amount of moisture content that we measure in the soil. Well, basically, there are two different ways. We can express it as gravimetric moisture content or in a volumetric moisture content. So what are the differences between the two different expressions? Well, very simple. The gravimetric moisture content is the expression in a mass basis. So it's basically would tell you how much mass of water in the dry soil, in a dry soil. And it can be actually calculated by using this equation. So it's the mass of water divided by the mass of dry soil. However, if you look at the volumetric moisture content, it tells you how much water is actually occupied in the pore spaces of the soil. So it's basically the volume of water divided by the volume of soil. And also it can be measured by multiplying the gravimetric moisture content times the bulk density. There are also some differences between them on how we measure them. So basically for the gravimetric moisture content, you go to the field, you take a soil sample, and after that, you put that sample in the oven for about 24 hours at 105 degrees Celsius. After that, actually, what you do, you use the equation, you subtract the moist soil minus the dry soil divided by the dry soil, and that would give you the gravimetric moisture content. The volumetric moisture content, again, as I said, it tells you how much water are occupied in the pore spaces of the soil, and it can be measured by multiplying the gravimetric moisture content times the bulk density. Let's take an example on the application of gravimetric and volumetric moisture content, and let's start with the gravimetric moisture content. So assume that you have a soil that you take a soil and its weight was about 75 grams before putting it in the oven dry. After the oven dry, after 24 hours at 105 degrees Celsius, the mass of the soil reduced to 50. So how can you measure the gravimetric moisture content? Very easy. Moist minus dry over dry. 75 minus 50 divided by 50 times 100, and that would give you 50%. Let's take another example. Assume that you take a sample, okay, from the field, you put it in a container. The sample plus the container weight was about 251. The weight of the container is about 5 grams. And after putting it in the oven dry, the sample or the weight reduced to 169 grams. So how can you do it? Again, very easy. First, you have to subtract the weight of the container from the moist and the dry weights. And then after that, you calculate the gravimetric moisture content. It's actually moist minus dry over dry, and that would give you 50%. If we take another example of the volumetric moisture content and the relationship between gravimetric and volumetric moisture content, if you use the same example and you have calculated already the gravimetric moisture content and you found it to be 50%, and you have the bulk density 1.3 gram per centimeter cube, what you're gonna do? Very simple. Gravimetric times the bulk density, and that would give you 65% of volumetric moisture content. There are actually different things that are very important in the soil and very important for scheduling irrigation and for other things. One of them is actually the soil water characteristic curve. What basically the soil water characteristic curve, or what we call it the retention curve, is basically showing the relation between the tension or the pressure and the moisture content. And basically it varies between different soil textures. So if you look, for example, at a fine soil texture, you would find that here at the x-axis you have the moisture content, at the y-axis you have the pressure. You can see that clay, for example, holds water actually more than the sandy or the loam soil, because it actually stores more water in the soil. And if you go to actually a coarser texture, you would find that it holds less. So actually at a given moisture content, the water is held tightly in the finer soil texture than the coarser texture. Something that you have to keep in mind that every texture would have a different retention curve. Why? Because it depends on it depends on the soil texture itself, and it depends on the pore size distribution in each soil texture. So if we look, for example, at a sandy soil, and we know that the sandy soil have larger pore spaces between it basically, when you apply water, it basically the water can drain very fast from the soil. And therefore what happens that it shows that at the increase of the pressure, okay, the moisture content reduced very much, because this kind of soil texture drains very quickly. If you look at the finer texture, you would find that it has a more uniform distribution of the pore sizes, and therefore the increase in the pressure, or the gradual increase in the tension, it actually lead to a gradual decrease in the soil moisture content. Why? Because this one has smaller pores, more uniform, and therefore it doesn't drain very fast as compared to the sandy soil. Now, what does the retention curve tell us, or what are the application of the retention curve? To understand the application of the retention curve, we have actually to see first the types of water content. Basically, there are three different types of or stages of moisture content in the soil. You have the moisture content at saturation and at field capacity, and the wilting and the permanent wilting point. All of these 3 points are actually very important to determine, or actually very important to present the amount of, or to present the status of the water content in the soil, and that ultimately would be very important for our application for the plant, for keeping our plant growing healthily. So the saturation is basically when all the pores of the soil are filled completely with water. And at this stage, actually, what happens that if you measure the volumetric moisture content, or if you measure the moisture content, volumetric or gravimetric, you would find that all your pore spaces are occupied with water. And if you measure the tension when the pore spaces are actually full of water, it will be 0. There is no tension. Remember from the past lecture. So actually what happens that in the field capacity, what happens that after some time, the gravimetric moisture content drain, and there will be some water that are actually held in the soil. And actually this is what we call the field capacity. The field capacity is the water content after saturation and drainage, when the gravimetric moisture content drained naturally by the influence of gravity. And usually this moisture content is held at the metric potential between -10 and -30 kilopascal. Now let's look at the permanent wilting point. The permanent wilting point, nothing, but it's basically the point at which the plant can no more extract the water. Why? Because this water now is held tightly in the soil. After the water drains and consumed, there will be some moisture content or some water that will be held tightly in the pore spaces. The plant has no it cannot absorb that water because it is tightly held in the soil, and therefore if the plant cannot use it, then it means they die. That's why they actually undergoing wilting. That's why we call it permanent wilting point. And this is actually measured, or this can be can occur at a metric potential of minus 1500 kilopascal. Something very important that we can get out of these three stages, the saturation, the field capacity, and the permanent wilting point, is actually to ask ourselves, what is actually how much water we should keep in the soil so the plant can grow healthily. Saturation is not good because all the pore spaces are occupied with water, which means that there will be no oxygen for the roots. Permanent wilting point, it's not good because all the water are now drained, consumed, and what is remained in the soil is held tightly by the soil, so the plant cannot use it. So we should keep our plant in a status that makes the water available for the plant, which means they can consume it without affecting their growth. And this is what we call the available water. The available water is basically the water between the field capacity and the permanent wilting point. And something very important that remember, since actually different soils have a different retention curves, the available water would vary between different soil textures. So if we look at one example, if we look at some of the things that we would see it in the coming slides, after understanding the water holding capacity, the water holding capacity is actually tells you that because the forces holding water in the soil are due to the surface attraction and the surface area, the more the surface area that you have in the soil, the more the soil can hold water. So again, in a similar way that we know that finer texture, the smaller the texture, the finer the texture, it means the higher the surface area. And the higher the surface area means there will be more space for water to be held in the soil. So finer soil holds more water than the coarse soils. And if you add more organic matter to the soil, you are actually increasing the surface area. Clay and organic matter increases the surface area. And actually what we can see that clay soil will hold more water, but is that water available for the plant? Well, much of that water will not be available for plant. Why? Because it will be held tightly in the small pores of the soil, of the clay. Sand hold less amount of water, but actually it will be available because the plant can take it. It's not held tightly in the soil. However, the sand would lose the water very fast, so it means you would have to irrigate more frequently. Silk loam is actually the texture which held the greater amount of the available water to plants. And this is actually an illustration show you how the water responds differently for each soil texture. So for clay soil, it won't infiltrate very fast. For the sandy soil, it infiltrates very fast because of the large pore spaces, and therefore it drains very quickly. For the loam, it is intermediate. This is actually an illustration, a figure that illustrates for you the water content and actually the soil texture and the available moisture content. So if we concentrate on the available water content and we look at the curve, how it shapes, the thicker the spaces, the more the available water content. So we can see that for sandy soil, it has lesser available water content. But if we go to a silk loam, it has the maximum available water content. And if you go for clay, again, it reduces. And again, the available moisture content or the available water content is actually the water between the wilting point and the field capacity. This is a table illustrating for you the available water content. How can we measure the available water content? Very easy. Available water content is actually the moisture content between actually the field capacity and the wilting point. So if you have, for example, sandy soil and the field capacity is 10 and the wilting point is 3% as a volumetric moisture content, then the available water content will be 7, 10 minus 3, and so on for each type of soil. Now you would see that if you look at the available water content, you would see that again the silt loam would have the highest, the sand would have the lowest, and this is actually for clay. Now let's take an exercise. Assume that we want to calculate the available water in a soil, okay, in a soil profile at different depths. So we have here the soil profile, the depth is from 0 all the way to 125, and the interval is actually 20, every 20 centimeter. So it's not necessary every 20 centimeter, but you can see this is the first layer, this is the second layer, third layer, fourth layer, and so on until the end. And what happens that we have the data of the depth and the data of the bulk density, data of the field capacity, and the wilting point. How can we calculate the water holding in volumetric, in the depth of the volume of the available water? Very easy. What we have to do, basically, we have this one here. First, we have to calculate the available water content in gravimetric basis. You see here, this is gravimetric moisture content. So field capacity minus wilting point, and then we should multiply times the bulk density, but we have to make sure that the bulk density are like in the same units. So you can convert this one from megagram per meter cube to gram per centimeter cube. If you convert it, you will see that it has the same unit. So 1 gram per centimeter cube is equal to 1 megagram per meter cube. And actually, you multiply it times the depth, and that would give you the depth of the available water. So basically, as you see here, it's simple. First, you calculate the available water, divide by 100. 22 minus 8 divided by 100 times the bulk density times the depth, and that would give you actually the available water content or the depth of the available water content at each profile. And then you can actually sum up all of these to get the total depth of the available water in the soil. Very easy. Okay, now this is what happens actually in the soil. This is how we express the moisture content in the soil. Now we understand this, but how does the water moves actually from the soil all the way to the plant? Well, very easy. We know that the first step for plant to absorb water is through their root system, and then it loses through the transpiration process. The water moves from the roots all the way to the atmospheres, to the plant and to the atmosphere. What happens that basically the roots have a complex network of the roots. And in the roots you have they are varying in the depth and the length and everything. And in the roots they have something called root hairs. Now what is the benefit of the root hair? The root hair actually increases the surface area and also the contact between the root and the soil. And this means that the plant would be able to absorb water. Now, what happens after the plants start absorbing water? How does the water move? This is actually an illustration. Here you have the root here, and then you have the other parts of the plants all the way to the xylem. So what happens that when the water actually absorbed by the root here, then the water moves due to the osmotic gradients. It means that you have differences in the salt concentrations. It moves from the root here all the way to the epidermis, cortex, and then to the endodermis. Once it reaches here, then it will actually move to the xylem اللي هذا مثل القصبات, to the xylem tube through actually the passage cell. What happens that when it reaches here to the xylem, then due to the adhesion and cohesion, the water moves. The adhesion actually, or the cohesion, is between the water molecules, and that what keep the water molecules like connected like this. And the adhesion between the water molecules and the surface in the xylem. And because you have actually, because when water is actually lost through the leaves due to transpiration, it induces a negative pressure, and this negative pressure is actually as a varying gradient, more negative at the leaves and all the way to the xylems in the roots. So what happens that now the water moves due to this pressure gradient in the xylem until it reaches actually the leaves, and then it will be lost to the atmosphere. Something now is very important for the plant: the amount of water and the quality of water. Now, here we have an experiment. It shows you that the amount of water, or the amount of the available water in the soil, would definitely affect the plant growth. If you always keep your plant in a drying condition, it means that you are keeping your plant very close to the permanent wilting point. That's not good for the plant, they will wilt. If you keep saturating your plant, it means you have all the pores filled with the water, and then you have actually less oxygen and air in the soil, in the pore spaces, and that also is not good for the plant. The plant die, they need oxygen as well. So what you have to do is actually to put your plant, or to put the water in actually in the status of in actually in the stage of the available moisture content. You try to put it in that range, and you don't allow it to fall beyond that range. You don't allow it to go to the saturation, and you don't allow it to go to the permanent wilting point. You maintain it at the actually at the available water content. So in this experiment, it shows like the amount of water is affecting the plant growth. As you can see that the lower percentage or lower amount of water, like closer to the permanent wilting point, means less growth. The plant are wilted. If you keep the plant in actually in, like, let's say 70% of the available moisture content, then the plant grow healthily. The quality of water is another important factor. Let's assume that you have sufficient amount of water in your farm. You have water, you don't have issue. You have a well, and you keep irrigating your plant, and you maintain actually available water content in your plant. But you see your plant are dying. What is the reason? One of the things can be actually the quality of water. And you should measure the quality of water, because the quality of water is very important for a plant, particularly the salinity of the plant. We know that each plant actually likes or can survive a certain salinity level. If we look at this example of lettuce, we can see in this figure illustrate for you the EC, electrical conductivity, which actually measures the salinity, indicates the salinity of the water, and the yield. And you can see that with the increase of actually the salinity beyond the threshold value, beyond the value by which the lettuce grows healthily at the salinity, the yield decrease, and the lettuce becomes smaller, and actually would be not that good. I mean, because you need to have a good plant growth. If we look at, and if we search for the threshold value of the salinity for lettuce, you would find it's 1.3 dc per meter cube. So in order to maintain a good growth for lettuce, you have to maintain a salinity actually less than or equal to 1.3. You always have to be at the safe side. So you should keep it less than 1.3. So you can maintain a good yield of lettuce. And actually the threshold values varies between each plant. So some of the plants are crop tolerant to or tolerant to salinity. They can survive higher salinity levels. Some of them are very sensitive, that they can even die and have a reduce in the yield at even a lower salinity value. Now, let's look at the last part of this lecture, which is actually the applications or the softwares that can be used to understand the soil-water plant relationship. One of these softwares, famous software, is HYDRUS. Well, HYDRUS can be used to actually to model the root water uptake. So let's look at this example. So in my master thesis, I have used HYDRUS to do some modeling. I have conducted an experiment where we design a soil structure called the smart capillary barrier, which is nothing, but it actually consists of a soil texture, of a finer soil texture, like in a block shape, surrounded by sand. By having this kind of structure, it basically creates a capillary barrier, a 3D capillary barrier that reduces evaporation losses from the soil and store water in the soil, and therefore you actually maintain like more water content in the soil. You don't lose the soil, you don't lose the water very quickly due to evaporation. And I compared this system with a control, which is basically without the smart capillary barrier structure, just fine soil, and then run the experiment. In the modeling, I have like modeled these different structures. Here you have the smart structure, and here you have the control. So what happens that later on I have actually used the model. I choose two different crops, tomato and lettuce, because they are commonly growing in Oman and they are very sensitive to drought. That's why I wanted actually to test it. And I use this root water uptake model, which actually in this equation, it shows you that the root water uptake, which is actually is a function of the stress and the potential root water uptake. In a simple way, if you look at this figure, you will understand it very much. Plant, actually, there is a stress for plant about the moisture content. We said that too much water is not good, less water is not good. Too much water means saturation. Water closer to saturation is not good for plant. Water closer to the permanent wilting point is not good for plant. It's actually a stress, and that actually will affect the root water uptake. How much water would be, or how much the plant can take the water from the soil, which means that if it is at the stress areas, then the plant experience stress and they will not produce a good yield and they die. So this figure here shows you like the root water uptake as a function and at different pressure stages. So if you look at this stage here, here is the saturation, and here is the permanent wilting point. And you can see that actually the root water uptake is basically the minimal. It's very minimum. It's actually stressed at these 2 points. So in order to be in the safe side, you have to keep it at the available water content. There will be no stress for the plant. Let's see at the application of the model. What I did, this is actually the modeling results for the tomato plants. Here is basically showing the volumetric moisture content and the time. What I did that in the model, I assumed that I add irrigation to the plant, to the soil, and then I like the moisture content reach closer to saturation, and then stop irrigation for 7 weeks. For 1 week, for 7 days, and then see how the plant respond. So in these 7 days, the water will be lost due to transpiration, evaporation, drainage, and therefore the plant would show symptoms of wilting and so on. So I want to see which soil dry faster and what is the response of the plant in these soils as a function of the moisture content. So if you look at the control, in the control, it was at 0.45 at the beginning, and then in 7 days, it drops almost by 50%. It drops to 0.25. And this is actually for having sensors at the top and the bottom of the soil. I mean, sensors here, and the same thing, sensor here, bottom and top. So whereas for the smart soil, because of the capillary barrier, it stores water and the water will not evaporate very fast from the soil, we can see that it maintained the moisture content, and even after 7 days, the moisture content was still in 0.335, above 35%, which means that you have more water in the soil as compared to here. Now, what happens to the plant? Now, I want you actually to focus more on the actual root water uptake, on this curve, and forget about the others. And also to focus on this curve here. The dashed line is basically the threshold value. If the actual root water uptake, the curve or the red curve, reach this stage, then the plant actually reach this stress. So what is a practical application? You always have to make sure that you have more water in the soil, or you have water in the soil, so therefore the actual water uptake curve would be above 0.5, which means no stress. We can see that the tomato in the control reached the stress after almost 4.5 days. It means that the moisture content in the soil dry very fast, according to this curve, dry very fast, and then it reached a stage where the plant start experiencing stress. Now, if you compare it to the control, because to the smart soil, because the smart soil have the capillary barrier and it actually stores the water in the soil, what happens that the moisture content is more in the soil, and therefore the plant did not experience stress, almost like it reaches after 5.5 days, and it still like did not go beyond 0.5. It's still like it. Now, what is the practical application of this? When do we have to irrigate? In such a soil, for such crop, you have to irrigate after 4 days. Otherwise, the plant experiences stress. So in order to alleviate stress, 4 days without irrigation, and then you have again to irrigate and so on every 4 days, the irrigation cycle. Whereas in this structure of the smart soil, you don't have, even you can irrigate once a week because the plant still did not experience so much stress. And then it will grow healthy. So this shows you the plant response and to moisture content as affected by the soil structure. Now, what happens with the lettuce? If you compare actually the moisture content curve for the control and for the smart soil, you would see that again for the control it dries very quickly because of the losses of evapotranspiration, whereas here in the smart it's still maintained at 0.4, very high moisture content. Now, how these plants experience? Do they experience stress or they are fine? What happens that for the lettuce, you would see that for the control ones, it experiences stress almost after 1 day. It reaches 1.5 days, it reaches actually the stress issues. And why it experiences stress? Because the soil dries very quickly. In the smart soil, even the plant also experiences stress after 1 day. But why this happen? You know why? Because this soil actually, or the lettuce roots are very shallow, and they don't consume, the lettuce do not consume that much water as compared to tomato, because the tomato's roots are deep. And what happens that the soil has a moisture content very close to saturation. And remember that curve, saturation is not good, permanent wilting point is not good, so the plant experience stress. So this is actually an illustration for you to manage irrigation and to show you how to use different softwares like HYDRUS to understand the soil-water plant relationship. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture. And if you have questions or so on, you can contact me on my email and ask me. You're most welcome. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye.